squaw was a woman. And a sun squaw is a woman chief. So the colonizers kind of came and took the word, and from my understanding, the reason why they put such a negative connotation on it was because when they arrived here, coming from a patriarchal society, they wanted to deal with the men. And what they were finding was that the men, even if they were chief or whatever, were having to go back and defer to the advisement of the woman, the clan mothers and all that. So they didn't like that. They didn't like having women involved in discussions. They didn't like the men going and saying, well, I need to check in with the woman. And this is kind of one of the main elements of the divide and conquer strategy that they utilized. They started to feed the ego of the men. So now you had chiefs who stopped acting like chiefs and started acting like kings, because that's how the Europeans saw them. And you know, with the king, what the king says goes, right? I don't need to talk to anyone. What I say goes. But with the chief, you always are needing to check in to make sure that what you're doing is appropriate for the people. So I wanted to make sure that that term was in there in the actual title so that we could start it off with understanding that women held and do hold at this moment a very, very prominent position in traditional New England indigenous culture. It is not anything uncommon for a woman to be a chief, for a woman to be a warrior. It's not uncommon for any of that in our culture. And we do have a number of them in the area at this moment. I know the Nipmucks have one, Pokadokits have one, the Chappaquiddics, there's a couple of different Chappaquiddick tribes, but the Chappaquiddics have one. So there are a number of them around. And once again, that's nothing that's out of the ordinary for us in this region. And we'll come back to that picture a little bit later on. But it will make sense when it comes back up, and I'll explain why it's on the cover there.
I think I know. I think I shot video there.
So Providence Cultural Equity Initiative, it is a nonprofit whose mission is to steward and ambassador Rhode Island's cultural sector and economy. And our vision is to transform Rhode Island into New England's premier cultural hub. And of course, that's just me being busy doing what I'm doing. One of the things I have been being very mindful to share with people is that although PCI does have a very, very prominent sort of relationship with the local American Indian culture, that's not all that PCI is about. That's just because I happen to be very involved in that background and culture. But we're all about the plethora of cultures that make this state such a fantastic place, and really pushing people to look at our culture and our cultural diversity as one of the state's greatest natural resources. Just like it does its oceans and its beaches, its wonderful forests, all of that good stuff. Let's treat our culture in that same manner. Our presentation overview. So tonight we're going to touch on a couple of different elements, but all within the sort of realm of understanding more about Quaiapen and who she was during this time period. So we'll start off with a review of Aboriginal Rhode Island. And I use that terminology purposely because of what it entails when you utilize the term of the original people. So especially when you're talking Rhode Island itself is a colonial English term. But we want to understand that before Rhode Island was Rhode Island, there was a very sophisticated and diverse population, governance structure, people here. So when I talk about Rhode Island and I talk about the indigenous heritage, I always like to utilize that terminology Aboriginal, because we're talking about the very first Rhode Islanders. Before Rhode Island was even a thought, these are the people that were here. So we'll do an overview of that. Then we'll just get a general understanding of who Quaiapen was, some of her history, who she was related to. When you find out who her relations are, you probably start to make a lot of connections in terms of other chiefs and what they were doing. Well then, actually that was supposed to be a little bit low, I meant to change that. We're going to jump over to the overview of the King Philip's War after that, because we're going to be looking at Quaiapen in terms of her relationship with the King Philip's War. We'll then look at the first battle of Nipsichuck. We'll then look at the Great Swamp Massacre. Then we'll look at Queen's Fort, and then we'll take a look at the second battle of Nipsichuck. And as we go through it, you'll start to see how Quaiapen ties into all of these. So let's start with Aboriginal Rhode Island. This is just one of my favorite maps. It's by Sidney S. Ryder. It's in the lands of Rhode Island as they were known to Canonicus and Miantinomi when Roger Williams came in 1636. And this is an Indian map of the principal locations known to the Nahegensets and elaborate historical notes. Some may not know that in the traditional dialects there were no R's around here. So it's always funny to me that the Nahigansets, and if you go back even before that, it was Nahiganics, but somehow ended up with not only one R, but two R's. So that's just always interesting, and I like to share that you know, once again, there was a whole culture and way of being before what we have right now. This particular map was made in 1903, as I mentioned, and it identifies the Indian names of locations and the locations of great events in Indian history with present political divisions. One in particular that's very interesting, that we've been doing some work with recently. I can't see it up on the map. You can see it, but there's a location on here called Satamache. If you are familiar with Johnston, where the BJ's is at, and the Home Depot and all that, you go up to the top of the hill. Well, if you notice, that place is called Stone Mountain Plaza. And when you do the translation from Narragansett to English, Satamache translates to Stone Mountain. And in conversation with some of the, you know, family and just going over this map, turns out that Satamache was the location where all of the chiefs from the different villages would come to meet to discuss the business of the nation. So it's up on a hill. When you're riding in from Route 6, you can see it. Now they've got some windmills and stuff behind it. But from that hill, you can see over to New Continent Hill. You can just see all of these spaces. And it was Flintstone up there. There's a lot of Flintstone up that way. So now you're getting into, and sandstone, and soapstone. So now you're getting into pipes. You're getting into arrows. But all of these different names were here before these places like Warwick, like Providence, all of these names popped up. So you can see here, first of all, much of where the Narragansett Reservation is right now is actually Niantic territories. And we'll get into that a little bit later on. But if you notice, the Narragansett territories run north of that, and most of the Narragansetts are actually down in the region where the reservation is right now. They're in this arena, and then if you look at the Showamet lands, those are still Narragansetts. That was Pumham who was the chief of that area. So the majority of the Narragansetts were living in the Greenwich areas up into the Providence areas. But contemporarily, we associate them with down in the Niantic territories. And as we get into particularly the Great Swamp Massacre, that'll start to make a little bit more sense why that is the way that it is. But this particular map was entered according to Act of Congress in the Office of the Librarian of Congress at Washington in the year 1903. So this is definitely a map that we can put some stock into and some confidence when we're looking at it to understand what was there before our contemporary understanding of Rhode Island stuff. So I really like this map. It's one that I like to show a lot when I do presentations. And when you get into that actual book that Sidney S. Ryder wrote, this is a quote that was from it. The number of villages of or under the dominion of the Nahigansett is a particular note as well, as it is seldom discussed in contemporary narratives of the Aboriginal presence of the inhabitants of Rhode Island. And these are just some of the villages. A lot of these names might sound familiar. Moshasset, Chibachuswa, Aquidneck, Cucumswick, Acupassantuxet, Showamet, which is Warwick, Locoquassic, Sikasset, Potwabmet, Aqueducet, and it just goes on. Aquapamuquak is Gould's Island, Connecticut, you know, what's that point out in Warwick? So all of these names that when you come here just sound really weird, usually Indian names, that they just kind of either kept or kind of changed a little bit to pronounce it better because the language was very hard for them to pronounce. And this is not even the total list. This was just some of the names that they were pointing out of different village areas where Nahigansett people were living. So literally, there were Nahigansets all over the state. When I spoke to John McNiff, I believe he told me prior to the King Philip's War, only 10% of the state's population was European. 10% of the state's population was European. That means 90% of the people in these lands were indigenous folks. And that should also let you know the true impact that the King Philip's War had on the indigenous populations that were in these lands when you go from 90% to what are Indians today? Maybe 1%, you know? So But once again, if you do get a chance, that's a fantastic read. He gets into a lot of the turmoil that was going on between Roger Williams and the Arnolds. He gets into a lot of the issues that were going on between Mass Bay and the colonies here, and what took place when they went and Mass Bay was trying to move in on Warwick. And it's just a really interesting read. I definitely suggest, if anyone hasn't, definitely give it a look-see. And it's pretty extensive. I think it's about 400, 500 pages. I haven't read all of it, but what I did read was very, very interesting. So Quaiapen, they refer to her, not so lovingly, as the Old Queen. She also had a number of different aliases. What you'll find in indigenous cultures traditionally is that the names weren't so much names as we understand them now, but they were more titles. So my name today is Two Hawks in the language, Nisuwishawanag. I go out tomorrow and I barehandedly kill a bear. My name changes to Kills Bear with Bare Hands. And the titles kind of acknowledge who you are, what you've accomplished, what your status is in the local community. From what I understand, the Massasoit, they call him Yellow Feather, that name was not the original name he had. That came after interaction with the colonial powers. And if I understand the story correctly, I forget if it was the Sagamore who told me, I think he was either gifted a yellow feather from one of the European authority figures and would go around with a yellow feather in his cap, and now he's Yellow Feather because he's a friend of these Europeans who came here, and he's the one that... So the titles of the individuals, when you go through, a lot of times they'll have 2 or 3 different aliases. Some of that was, of course, running and hiding from Europeans who might be after him. So if she was Matantuk, when the Europeans come and engage with her, oh, no, that's Magnus. And they're like, oh, well, we're looking for Matantuk. Oh, okay, don't know. So a lot of that was going on, but for the most part, it was dealing with what their experiences or accomplishments were in the society that they were in. So Quaiapen, she was born into a prominent Eastern Niantic family. Now, what's very interesting is the further back you go, particularly with the Nahigansets, you find that most of the chiefs were coming out of the Barnstable, Massachusetts area. So I've actually had the opportunity to speak with Chief Caringhands from the Natick, Massachusetts, and confirm that pretty much all of the southeastern New England tribes, when you go back far enough, actually have their roots in the Massachusetts. And what was going on was, as family does, we're not getting along with each other. So I move with my people over to this land area over here, and we start to identify ourselves with this space over here. So now you get the Massachusetts who are up there, but I'm not getting along with the Massachusetts, so I'm moving down here, and now I'm a Nahigansett, the people of the Small Point. Why? Because we moved into this region where the Small Point is. Nipmucks moved to where there's fresh water at. They're now the freshwater people. And this is how these names come about, but ultimately, the bloodlines are all tying back. If you talk to the Sagamore, he'll tell you that the Massasoit's father was Mixano, who was a Narragansett. So how did he then become Pokanoket if his father was a Narragansett and I believe his mother was a Nipmuck? How did this Pokanoket thing come about? Well, they moved into the area that they were calling Pokanoket, and now they were the Pokanokets. So you literally have in one generation a switch from what would be considered one nation to another. And then not only is he known as the Pokanoket now, but now he's known as the Massasoit. And Massi means great, so Massasoit translates to great leader. So this was all just extended family having infighting, not getting along with each other, and moving to different areas and changing what they titled themselves. But she was born into a prominent Eastern Niantic family. Remember, there's the Eastern Niantics and then there's the Western Niantics, and that split comes when the Pequots move into the area after getting permission, and then start turning on everyone after they get settled in. She was also sister of the sachems Ninigrit and Wepatonic. And if you're familiar with Ninigrit, he was the chief of the Niantics. So she is the sister of another chief, 2 other chiefs. So of course, what's that going to tell you about her pedigree and her stock? She has the right to be a chief as well. Around 1630, she married Mixon and had 2 sons, Scutup and Quaiapen, and a daughter, Quinimiquit. And there was also a possible union with the Eastern Pequot leader, Mamoho, which may have produced another daughter, Asku Suduk. But what's very interesting about this time, especially with Quaiapen, and you'll see it with Weedamo as well, is they have several different marriages going on. And most of the time, these marriages were coming out of political alliances, looking to further relationships between the different tribes, you know, and just wanting to ally themselves to be in a more powerful position with all of the indigenous politics that were going on and still go on to this day. The picture that's there is from a website called Keepers of the Bay, Part 3, The Return of Sovereignty. And it was just a bust of what someone thought Quaiapen might have looked like. I don't think that there are any true life depictions of her from that time period, but this was just a bust that someone had created. So we have an understanding of that aspect of Quaiapen. After the death of Mixon in 1657, Quaiapen established leadership over Niantic villages within 4 miles west of Smith's trading post in Kakukumsukuk, where she lived in a fort made partly of stone. So not only is she a chief, but she's overseeing several different villages. So the way the culture goes, each village would have had a chief, and then that chief would have paid homage to a greater chief that would have been kind of paying attention on a regional level. Not much different than the governors and the mayors of today. Not much different than the governors of the mayors of today. And then following the death of her sons, she became one of the chief Narragansett sachems and gained control over an additional 15-mile portion of the Narragansett country. And once again, that's because the Niantics are just cousins of the Narragansetts. So if she's marrying a Narragansett, if they have those relations, if she's a great warrior, if she's doing a lot of work, the Niantics and the Narragansetts were very close, but now she's a Narragansett chief, and she's given more lands that she can oversee and kind of be over. So that's to start off with the general understanding of Quaiapen, the old queen, the level of prominence that she had, the level of respect that she commanded, and the fact that she came from royal bloodlines. So it was nothing for her to be a chief because that's what her family was. That's what her family line was. And once again, no one's going to say, well, she can't be a chief, she's a woman. They're going to say, no, that's Ninigrid's sister. She's been in battle. She's, won many battles. Yeah, we should be following her. She's a great leader. Once again, a different mind state than what the Europeans were coming over with, where women were subjects. I'm in law school right now, so they were actually at a certain point considered chattel property. Could not bring lawsuits or any of that sort of stuff. All had to go through their husband, who was the man. So you have these individuals coming over here, and imagine these individuals with their, male chauvinistic sort of having to talk to a Quaiapen and having her get uppity with them and having her tell them that she doesn't like them and doesn't want them around and they're not welcome in her town. How does that go over with the male ego? So later on we'll see that she was highly feared by the European colonists, not only for being a great warrior, but because she was a woman moving in this capacity. And that was just really against what they were used to in their society. And this is a really nice picture, right? This is from, what's going on, Chief? How you doing? I want to take a moment to acknowledge Chief Red Spirit of the Wabaquasa Nipmucks. Thank you for being here, Chief. So this is out of a book called The Portrait of King Philip's War, The History of King Philip's War, a pictorial history of King Philip's War. I found this in the archives, just Googling, from the Library of Congress, I believe. This was inducted as Sidney S. Ryder's was. And what I was really blown away with was the fact of the skin tone of King Philip, the way that they portrayed him. If you look at most contemporary depictions of Indians, they're usually very, very fair-skinned. But in my understanding of the history, particularly in this area, a lot of the Indians were categorized as Negroes when they got here, when Europeans were engaging with them, which says to me that a lot of them probably were of this complexion, maybe even darker. Chief, how you doing, sir? So this is in that history book. It's about 300 to 400 pages, and it just goes through all of the different battles. Chief Standing Wolf from the Uskapag, Nahentic Narragansett tribe. Be here, Chief. Thank you, sir. Pictorial illustration and pictorial history of King Philip's War by Dale Struck, Jr. and William Croom. This was published in 1853 by H. Wentworth, and it's in the Americana collection of the Library of Congress. And you're going to see I pull a lot of these pictures from this book and put them in this presentation just to see the diversity of the Indians and what they look like, because as dark-skinned as this brother is, there's other depictions of Indians as light-skinned as our brother Dave here. And what you'll find when you look at what some of the initial comments about the Indians in this region were, starting with Verrazano, he said they range in skin tone from as fair-skinned as Europeans to a tawny brown. So there was no one particular complexion, one particular hair texture, none of that here in New England. I won't speak about other regions, but in New England, there was a great diversity of what an Indian looked like. And of course, as European colonization moved on, that was one of the key elements that they played upon in terms of dividing the nations and the people. So King Philip's War is from 1675 to 1676. It's also called the Great Narragansett War in British American colonial history. I was over in Europe a couple months ago. I was just so amazed by how receptive they were of anything to deal with American Indians. Did not once get asked, well, you don't look like it. None of that happened. As soon as I mentioned I'm an American Indian, oh, from what tribe? And when I mentioned Narragansetts in particular, they were like hungering to know more, because this is history that's well known over there. We're coming into it now, but in other parts of the world, this is history that's well known. And there were a number of parties to the conflict. So you had the Wampanoag tribe, which isn't really a tribe. Wampanoag was a term that Philip was using to bring all of the tribes together. Wampen is Eastern, and Og is usually the plural, so the Easterners. And what he was saying was, look, let's put aside all of the divisions amongst the tribe. Let's gather together as Easterners to fight against this colonial aggression we have going on. So truth be told, Narragansetts, Nipmucks, anyone who fought against the Europeans is considered a Wampanoag. But when you look at who the Wampanoags are today, it's most of the tribes who stayed out of the war. So it's just very interesting how that term has changed in terms of who it relates to or describes. But parties to the conflicts would be the Wampanoags, which should be probably the Pokanokets, led by King Philip against the English. The Nipmuc tribe, allied with King Philip. The Narragansett tribe, eventually allied with King Philip. We'll talk about that in a little bit. The Pocumtuck tribe. Who's heard of the Pocumtucks? And yet it was a tribe that was allied with King Philip at the time. And then, very interesting, the Mohegan tribe allied with the English. The Mohawk tribe allied with the English. As I understand it, Philip made his way up to Mohawk territory to ask them to help with the English, and they ended up attacking them. And that was kind of the final blow that really just kind of wiped out his ability to resist, because you go to ask Indians to help you, and instead they end up attacking you. So that was very interesting. And then, of course, you had the New England Confederation, which was Mass Bay, New Haven Colony, Plymouth Colony, and Connecticut Colony. And then the colony of Rhode Island supposedly remained neutral in the war. I guess so. I guess it depends on which group of Indians you're talking to. Of course, we know Roger Williams had very good relationships with the Narragansetts. Talked to the Pokanokets who were across the little bay right there, and they got a whole different story about him and what he did. So this is all, perspectives on what's going on. But as you can see, this was a war. From what I understand, I think maybe it's in the next slide. I don't want to get ahead of myself. Yes, the King Philip's War to this day remains one of the bloodiest conflicts per capita in U.S. history. This is from Weltering in Their Own Blood. It states, recent scholarship has underscored the carnage inflicted by King Philip's War. In terms of population, King Philip's War was the bloodiest conflict in American history. 52 English towns were attacked, a dozen were destroyed, and more than 2,500 colonists died, perhaps 30% of the English population of New England. So just imagine that, if 30% of New England was killed in a war today. Just imagine that. How many millions of people are in New England? We could, probably conservatively say maybe 8-9 million. So imagine 30% of 8 or 9 million people died in a war. And mind you, that's just the English population. We're not talking to Indians. At least twice as many Native Americans were killed. So that means 60% of the Indian population was killed during the King Philip's War. And then so many more were shipped off into slavery, into the Caribbean, or over into Europe. A lot of people don't know that the transatlantic slave trade actually started with Indians being shipped out after the King Philip's War, after the Pequot's War in 1638, they were shipping them out into these places. And then if you get down, a lot of them were being shipped into Barbados in particular after the war. You'll find that there's actually an act in Barbados to prohibit the importation of New England Indian slaves. Because the slaves were going down there and riling up the Indians on the islands down there and stoking revolts. So New England Indians were just really bad. You didn't want to deal with New England Indians at the time. The New Englanders didn't want them. The Caribbean didn't want them. So they were just shipping them all around. But that's really kind of where the transatlantic slave trade started, with Indians being shipped out. Some historians estimate that the combined effects of war, disease, and starvation killed half the native population of the region. The war left an enduring legacy. And this right here is a picture of the death of Sas Amon. And I just want to go back to this one. You can see this brother, how tawny his skin tone is. That is supposedly a depiction of Comanche. So once again, you can see the differences in hairstyles. His hair looks to be a little bit more kinky. If we go back to King Philip's, his hair looks to be a little bit straighter. And then when we get here to Sas Amon, he is much fairer skinned and he looks more like your stereotypical sort of American Indian that people are used to. So we're getting ready for the King Philip's War, and it all starts with the first battle of Nipsachuk. Now if you notice when I did the overview, it was the first battle and then the second battle. So we'll start with the first battle. And the first battle of Nipsachuk was the first engagement of the King Philip's War in the colony of Rhode Island. It was in late July of 1675, and this is when Philip had retreated from Montauk to Nipmuc country. So the Nipmuc territories play a key role in the King Philip's War. He had gone through Rhode and the Gore, which is Cumberland, crossing the Patuxent River, and he was being pursued by forces from Taunton, Rhode, Swansea, and Providence. What was very interesting about the time is that the European colonists really had they had some understanding of the land, but not like the Indians. So you'll find a lot of battles were going on, and in spaces where you think Philip would have been killed, somehow he gets away with his people. Well, why? Because these are his lands, and he knows them like the back of his hands. So this should also explain to you why a lot of the Indians were being shipped out instead of being kept right here, because on any given night, as soon as the chance gets, they're gone. They're off into the woods, you can't find them. They're mixing in with other tribes, you don't know who's who, they're all Indians. So once again, one of the best things that they could do at the time was just to get them out of here and then bring in others who weren't as familiar with the lands, who weren't even used to this landscape or territory, who are going to be a lot more afraid to run off because they don't know where they're going, they don't know who to connect with, so they're going to stay and they're going to do what you need them to do. On July 31st, Philip's forces are discovered encamped on an Indian field belonging to Philip's men called Nipsachuk. So this is where the first battle starting, and in this picture right here, King Philip escaping from the swamp on a raft, once again getting away from all of the people that are trying to capture him. This particular information is found in volume 6, 1888, the Narragansett Historical Register. I put all of the sources right at the bottom. In case I don't mention them, you can see them right at the bottom down there. So, first battle of Nipsachuk, August 1st, the English fire upon foraging Indians shortly before dawn. So the English fire first on the Indians. The camp ends up escaping with haste. Philip's fighting men showed themselves on a nearby hill, and the battle continued from dawn until about 9 p.m. that night. And 30 of Philip's warriors are killed, including Nimrod, one of his chief counselors. And I like all of these different names. I like going through these histories because it starts to put actual names and you can kind of personalize the people that are involved. It's not just the Indians. There were specific Indians who held specific authority and worked with each other and worked under each other. It was a sophisticated society. They weren't savages like the colonists portrayed them to be. The colonial forces were eventually forced to retreat to Providence after the battle. And then August 3rd, under the command of Captain Andrew Edmonds, the colonial forces began to re-pursue, and they came upon Philip at a fort in Nipmuc country. But from what I understand from reading it, they kind of sat outside the fort for a while and realized they weren't going to be able to get in. If I'm not mistaken, the Indians that were in the fort were making some obscene gestures to them and saying some pretty rude things to them, and there was nothing they could do about it. So on August 7th, the colonial forces dispersed to Norwich and Mendon. And once again, this picture here is the Nipmuc and Lancaster Indians planning their attack on Lancaster. But that was the first battle of Nitsitchuk. That was kind of really what set the King Philip's war off. And once again, Philip escaped, but it was the Europeans who kind of initiated it based off of the ongoing hostilities that had been taking place. Now look at this brother right here. Once again, look at the skin tone. So you've got King Philip, you've got Cananchek, but then you've got this brother right here. And this was chapter 5 of the book I was telling you about, Pictorial History. The War in the Nipmuc Territory, Defense of Brookfield. So this is from Dr. Paul Robinson, Principal Archaeologist for the Rhode Island Historical Preservation and Heritage Commission, from the minutes of their July 8, 2009 meeting. It says the first battle occurred shortly after the beginning of the war as Colonial Mohegan Indian forces pursued and fought the Wampanoag leader Phillip and Pecasset tribes Sunksqua, Weedamo, and their soldiers at Nipsichuk. Now, once again, notice that I said that the Europeans didn't really know the lay of the land like that, so how were they able to move? They were getting help from other Indians. And that is one of the biggest issues. When people talk about the Indian wars and how the colonists beat them, what we have to keep in mind is that the reason that the Indian forces lost is because there were Indians fighting on the side of the colonists, thinking that somehow, some way, if they sided with the colonists, then when the war was over, they would be taken well care of. But of course, we know that wasn't the case. Once they got rid of the adversarial Indians, well, you're still an Indian, so you got to go too. And this is where a lot of the praying Indian towns came from. This is how that tragic situation happened on Dare Island, where they pretty much just took and threw them out there with no fire, no nothing, wouldn't let them come off the island. And these were the Indians who had supported and stayed out of the war and were assimilating and becoming good Christians. And they were still tossed onto the island after the ones who decided to fight were killed and sent off into slavery. Contemporary critics and historians condemned the militia for not defeating Philip and ending the war there. Instead, Captain Henchman, perhaps uncertain of battle tactics in the densely vegetated swampland, let the tribal defensive units of Philip and Weedamo escape after inflicting some casualties, and as a result, the war continued for another year. So they were saying you should have killed them when you had the chance. Of course, he didn't, and once again, the war went on to the statistics that we mentioned earlier. First battle of Nissachuk, so as they mentioned, it was Philip there, but it was also Weedamo. And once again, another woman chief. And her aliases, Withaho, Witamo, Winunchis, Watamore, Namumpum, and Tatapananum. So all different aliases. She was born between 1635 and 1640 on the shores of Cape Cod. Once again, Barnstable. The chiefs are coming out of that Barnstable area down there. Mattapoisett village of the Pokanoket. She was the daughter of Cabotant, who was sachem of the Pecasset tribe. And she was the Sunksqua of the Pecasset. So once again, your father's a chief. You're his oldest child. You've clearly been raised in the ways of a chief. The warriors know who you are. You've probably shown yourself in battle and all that. Doesn't matter if you're a woman. Can you lead? Are you a great warrior? Do you have the respect of the people? You're the chief. And that's the way it went. And she had several marriages. Once again, a lot of times for political alliances. But she married Winniperkit, who was sachem of Saugus. She then married Juan Sutter, who was sachem of Pokanoket. That was Philip's older brother, but he was killed. She then married Quaiapen. After that, she married a Patanawit, but she divorced him because it was brought out that he was a traitor, or at least thought to be a traitor, so she didn't want anything to do with a traitor, so he's done. And then Quaiapen of the Niantics was one of her last marriages. When I was doing this presentation and came to this point in North Smithfield, one of the women that was there asked, so they were just able to get rid of their husbands like that? I said, yeah, if there was a war. And what would the people say, or the men say? I said, they probably said nothing. Probably kept their mouth shut, because she's the chief. So that went over very well with the woman up in North Smithfield when I was sharing that. Not that we promote divorce or anything like that, but for the simple fact that women held a equal status in terms of their importance to the tribe and their ability to be leaders and respected leaders in the tribes at this time. And this is an illustration, Weedamo, Heart of the Pecassets, from the Royal Diaries of Patricia Clark Smith. Once again, don't know if that's actually what she looked like, but this is always good to have some sort of visual representation. She allied with Metacom and Quaiapen and led raids against the English settlements in Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island in 1675 and 76. And unfortunately, she drowned while crossing a river on her way to battle. Her body was found by English soldiers on August 3rd, 1676. And once again, because we're getting ready to get into Quaiapen, right? This is how much hatred they had for the woman chiefs. Because once again, it's that male ego, it's that chauvinistic stuff. It's that, how is she a chief? What do you mean I got to go and talk to her about land? What do you mean she said no? All of that's going on, right? The soldiers mounted her head on a pole outside an English settlement as proof that she had been defeated. They wanted everyone to know that she was actually dead. They didn't want, maybe that's her. No, this is actually her. She's dead. We got rid of her. So she was, once again, a sunk squaw, one of the prominent woman chiefs during the King Philip's War. But she died August 3rd, 1676, crossing a river on her way to battle. So now we're getting a little bit closer. This is all going to make sense tying into Quaiapen in a moment. The Great Swamp Massacre, December 20th, 1675. If you notice, I mentioned earlier that the Narragansetts eventually got involved. Because up until this point, this Great Swamp Massacre, the Narragansetts were staying out of the war. But the problem was that they were taking in people who had been fighting on Phillip's side, and they were, supporting them. And the English didn't like that. And they were telling them, well, you have to give them up, you shouldn't be involved. And they're saying, well, we're not involved. And at the same token, we're not, these are our kindred, these are our extended family, so we're not going to give them over to you, but we are staying out of the war. So Winslow, he was leading the forces at that time. He attacked the Indians, and he did so before the rest of the army was in position. And as a result, they were driven back with heavy losses. This was, if I understand it, it was a snowy night. They're in the middle of the swamp. That was part of the reason why the Colonial Forces were able to be so successful, because the water had frozen, so they could walk on it. It would have been a lot harder if it had been swampy, like it had been, because now you got to get through the water, and the Indians know all the paths and all that, so you're trying to figure out a path. They know where it's at. They're shooting at you while you're trying to figure out a path. Not going to be a very successful battle. Eventually, Captain Benjamin Church led another coordinated assault that was able to break through the log palisade, and the fort was finally taken and burned. As a result of the fort being taken and burned, many elders, Indians, women, and children were burned alive. And a lot of them, as they were escaping, were shot in the back by the colonists. I've heard over 1,000 elders, women, and children were killed in the Great Swamp Massacre. And Phillip and some of the Indians escaped through the swamp, but many of them died from exposure. And this is just a map of what was going on. If you look on the map right here, you will see red X, and that's where they're saying that the fight took place at. And this comes out of the Rhode Island Society of Colonial Wars record of the unveiling of the monument commemorating the Great Swamp Fight. So that's where that map is from. And you can see swamps all around it, down in the West Kingston area. And now there's actually it looks like there was a railroad running by the place or through the space where they had the battle at. This is a plaque that is up down there. If you go to visit, I believe you see it on the way in, but it's not very noticeable. That's why for PCEI we're more in favor of monuments, because we want people to know that these things are here. Plaques are cool, but you might not notice a plaque. And this is a very important plaque to be noticed. It reads, 3/4 of a mile to the southward on an island in the Great Swamp, the Narragansett Indians were decisively defeated by the united forces of the Massachusetts Bay, Connecticut, and Plymouth colonies, Sunday, December 19, 1675. As I mentioned, many elders, Indians, women, and children were burned alive, which is why this incident has also been termed the Great Swamp Massacre. And if you notice, that's why I labeled it. And once again, Phillip and some of the Indians were able to escape, but many of them died from exposure. Once again, it was snowing, very cold night. And this picture is taken from a website, occultworld.com. How amazing, right? Our history is somehow in the occult world. Because the Indians don't exist in Rhode Island anymore. And this is just a picture of the actual monument. I couldn't find the ones I took when I went down there. But what it is pretty much is a pillar in the middle with 4 stones around it. And really it's a monument to the colonial powers that won. It's not really memorializing or honoring the Indians who were fighting to protect their lands. It's honoring the colonial powers who massacred them. And if you think about it, if the pillar in the middle was to represent the Indians, you've got them surrounded on all sides by the colonial powers. So what was the real intent with them putting that there? And then from what I understand, it's not even where the actual battle took place. So it's always interesting when you have, especially earlier on when they were doing this, like early 1900s, the mindset that was going into, well, we're going to honor these people by making a monument where we're surrounding them, not even at the space where it took place. There was another one that they did, I talk about it in the presentation, Providence's Indian History. It was supposed to be Canonicus Rock, and they pretty much grabbed a big rock, and they held a ceremony to celebrate the last of the Narragansetts. And then invited a Narragansett to be at the ceremony, so it just doesn't make sense. None of it makes sense. And then they said that they grabbed the rock because it was natural and weather-worn, and it was a representative of the passing Indians and how they were natural and weather-worn, juxtaposed against the progressiveness of contemporary colonial society. So you just grab a big rock, and then you say, yeah, we're going to take this rock and we're going to honor you next to all of this new stuff that we're building. So the rock would have been next to, monuments of prominent Englishmen who passed away. It would have been marble and all of that sort of stuff. And then there you just have this big rock that's supposed to represent one of the great chiefs of the Narragansetts. But if you get the chance, I definitely suggest at least taking a ride down to check the monument out, because it is part of Rhode Island's very, very important history. I always like to talk about the fact that this state, in my opinion, has had a profound impact on the world. If there's no winning of the King Philip's War, arguably there's not a United States after that. If Roger Williams doesn't run here and meet the Narragansett people and learn about the concepts of freedom of speech and freedom of religion and democratic values, then none of that takes place and transforms the U.S. into what it did. And of course, if there's no U.S., right, well, what type of world are we living in today? So in my opinion, Rhode Island is really the reason, in large part, why the world is the way that it is today. And this Great Swamp Massacre and this monument is memorializes that role that these lands have. This picture on the left is a depiction of Queen's Fort, or the ruins of Queen's Fort. And what Queen's Fort was the place that Quaiapen was at as the King Philip's War was going on. And why it's important, why I put it in this timeline, is because after the Great Swamp Massacre, the ones who survived were running all different locations. A lot of them ended up going and staying with Quaiapen at Queen's Fort. From what I understand, this fort was never found during the King Philip's War. They found it after she had been killed. And if you don't know what you're looking for, you won't be able to find this. It's down in the Exeter region. It's off of a main road, but there's just a bunch of forest around. So I'm thinking back then, if these roads aren't there and all that, wow, this is just a lot of forest to have to navigate through. And if you don't know where you're going, it wouldn't be hard to miss it at all. So this particular fort, and this is a plan of Queen's Fort sketched by Henry B. Hammond on November of 1865, once again in the Rhode Island Historical Society collections of October 1923. It was located in the northeastern portion of the town of Exeter in Rhode Island. It consists of dry laid stone walls, and it's traditionally associated with Quaiapen and Stonewall John. Stonewall John was a Narragansett who was supposed to be a master stonemason and did a lot of the stonework that we see down in the region. People were kind of under his tutelage, and it said that he built this particular fort specifically for Quaiapen, for her support as the war was going on. Quaiapen constructed the stone defense early in the King Philip's War, so seeing that war was coming, being a military-minded chief, John, we need something here to protect us in case things go awry, and here comes Queen's Fort. It's reported to have been the site of the first punitive raids against the Narragansett Indians during the King Philip's War, but I'm not sure if that's the case. I think it was in that region. But like I said, I've read other reports where they said that they didn't find the fort until after. And it was a refuge for the survivors of the Great Swamp Massacre. So once again, showing the level of authority and respect that Quaiapen had. Where else do we run but to Quaiapen? She'll protect us. We just got slaughtered, all of our women. let's go find the chief. And once again, no fear that she's a woman, so she might not be able to protect us. This is Quaiapen. This is the old queen, and this is her fort. So we're going to go there, and we're going to be protected by her. And once again, this information is coming out of Preservation RI. They actually did an actual archaeological report on the fort. And if you check that, I'm happy to send these slides out to anyone who would like to see them. If you go there, you can see what they were actually writing in terms of the history and the archaeological findings at the fort. Another picture of the fort. The first reference to Queen's Fort is found in Rhode Island records, is in the colony's official records for 1724. So that's about 50 years after the war is the first reference to Queen's Fort. It was only 48 years after Quaiapen led her people to the north. So what you'll find is that once they're in the fort, of course, because the war's going on around them, it's pretty slim in terms of being able to hunt and all that. You don't necessarily want to go out there because you might run into Europeans, in which case they could follow you back to the fort. So eventually they make the decision to start heading north, and that's where we'll get into the Second Battle of Nipsachuk in a bit. But in dividing North Kingston into 3 districts for the purposes of forming 3 companies of the militia, one of the boundaries was referred to as Queen's Fort, so-called. So the colonists at the time were acknowledging that, yeah, we know that that fort's there, that's where Quaiapen was, and once again, very prominent chief. And prior to 1724, no historians have previously mentioned this reference. This picture right here comes directly out of that PDF download from the Archaeological Society. This is another one, map of Queen's Fort, so a little bit better depiction of what the Queen's Fort looked like. And you can see on one side there's a lot of boulders there, other boulders around. But Elisha R. Potter, Jr. of Kingston, the earliest historian of the Narragansetts in 1835, recorded, "There are the remains of an Indian fort still known by the name of Queen's Fort near the line between North Kingston and Exeter. It is on the summit of a high hill," so once again they're going to put it up on the hill, right, so that they can see who's coming. "And then also it's a lot harder to take me if I'm up on the hill shooting down at you, and you have to shoot up at me and climb up at me." So from a military standpoint, it makes a lot of sense to have it up on a hill looking down so you can see, and so you can see over the land. It is on the summit of a high hill completely covered with rocks, and the fort appears to have been surrounded with a strong stone wall, so there's Stonewall John. There is a hollow in the rock, known as the Queen's Bedroom, and a large room, the entrance to which is nearly concealed, which is supposed by tradition to have been a hiding place for the Indians, in which arrowheads, etc., have often been found. So this is where she was controlling and kind of governing from at this time as the King Philip's War is getting started. 1889, J.R. Cole, once again another depiction coming out of that report again. "The sides of this hill on the east, southeast, and south are covered with a mass of stones more or less irregular in shape and so thrown together as to form natural caverns and retreats." So these stones are there, and you'll find that when you get up in there, they were able to get down into the stones. So you figure if you're getting attacked, now you've got a back entrance to run out, and how are they going to know which area of the boulders you're going to come out of? But you'll know, because you put this fort together. So it's just showing the military genius and prowess of the Indians at that time, but in particular Quaiapen, to have this fort constructed. The hill is covered with a thrifty growth of chestnut trees. On the top of the hill is a stone wall fortifying its approach. The wall runs east and west, and at either corner were once stone huts, probably the residence of some Indian chief. From both of these points, the wall runs south, but only for a short distance, the south side being naturally fortified. And in a small valley just west of the wall is a unique collection of stones forming a natural cavern in which it is said Magnus, the squaw sachem, other names for Quaiapen, once resided. And then here's the picture we started with in the beginning. This is supposedly a picture of the Queen's Chambers. So I was reading a little article on it. Some guys had gone there looking for it, and they said that they went into this space, but that when they got in there, it was supposedly said that the chambers were high, about 6-7 feet off the ground, the top of it, and that you could fit 20 Indians in there. But they get in there and they're saying, well, this isn't 6 or 7 feet off the ground, and you can't fit 20 Indians in here. But then they remembered that it was said that the cavern was supposed to have had a sand floor. So they start digging, and they're just digging up leaves. So then they stick something down further, about 2 or 3 feet, and it keeps going, so they dig up more leaves. Then they dig something down a little bit further, and it keeps going, and in their minds, they're saying, wait,
Could this just be the accumulation of 300 years of leaves that are on the floor like this, which is why we don't... So, from what I understand, there's still some speculation in terms of exactly where the cabin was at, but this is supposedly one of the spaces that people are favoring. And once again, out of that same report from Preservation RI, perhaps the most persistent legend is that of the Queen's Bedchamber. The cabin where Quaiapen is said to have slumbered was variously described in the late 19th century as nearly 7 feet in height and capable of holding 20 men, and as being very square and very well proportioned. So this is where she would have been. This would have been like her royal bedroom, I guess. You know, you go into the king's chambers, no one can come in and all that. But she's doing into the ground, and I would imagine that there were probably some backwards exits out of it and all that sort of stuff. But once again, the indigenous folks utilizing the environment to their benefit rather than trying to necessarily change it around like we see in contemporary society. So instead of chopping down all the trees and all that, right, you work with them. Instead of digging up all the gravel and sending it somewhere else, you figure out a way to incorporate it into your fortifications. And then you have individuals like Stonewall John who are so skilled with their hands that they're able to take the natural elements of the environment around them and create a fortification that is able to withstand colonial attacks. So now we get into the second battle of Nipsichuck, and we're going to bring Quaiapen back into the equation. What you'll see here, the picture on the left, this is a cast of the reconstructed heads of 2 Narragansett Indians. The one on the left is the young daughter of Sachem Ninigret, the other a man from Cononicut Island. But I read somewhere else that they actually think that that might have been a depiction of Quaiapen. So once again, you can see what the other one was with the very long hair, right? But then you see this one, and it doesn't necessarily look like that stereotypical sort of American Indian that everyone's used to. And once again, this is speaking to the diversity of the populations here in these New England territories. So Quaiapen, so in 1667, Quaiapen and Ninigret began a campaign against Medicon's attempts to forge a Wampanoag-Nipmuc alliance. So Phillip is initially trying to forge an alliance with the Nipmucs against the European forces, and Quaiapen and Ninigret aren't having it because they're Niantics. And once again, you can see the internal politics of the issues the tribes that were here. Because why there's these issues going on with the colonists, the tribes are still fighting with each other. So Narragansetts are fighting with Pequots. They get together with the Mohegans and they go in and crack the Pequots. And what's crazy is the Mohegans were Pequots. Uncas was a Pequot. He got mad, he wanted to be a big chief, so he stepped away with the Mohegans. And now he's linking up with the Narragansetts to fight against his own family. You have the Poconokas linking up with the Nipmucs, but the Niantics don't like that. And then the reason that Phillip signed the original peace treaty with the colonists is because the Narragansetts were chasing him around. So all of these internal Indian politics were going on, and that was what really allowed the European colonists to gain a strong foothold here. Once again, the Indians fighting with each other, and the Indians siding with the colonists against other Indians. But by 1671, Quaiapen had become persuaded by the Wampanoag's anti-English argument. So this is about 4 years before the King Philip's War kicks off. Of course, we know in December 1675, this is after the Great Swamp Massacre. Soldiers under Josiah Winslow attacked the villages that are in her region, burning about 150 wigwams, killing 7 and taking 9 prisoners. And after the sort, Quaiapen decides that she needs to get out of that region. It's a little too adversarial down there. And this is when she starts to make her way up into the Nipmuc territories. And this is where we're starting to get to the second battle of Nipsichuck. So once again, Quaiapen takes in all of the people that are down there. Oh, and this is the point that I want to make. So when we speak about the fact that today, where the Narragansett Indian Tribe Reservation's at, is really actually Niantic territory. After the Great Swamp Massacre and after the King Philip's War, what you found was that a lot of the Narragansetts who survived went and moved in with the Niantics. Because once again, they were distant cousins anyway, and then collectively, the two groups together started to call themselves Narragansetts. The Narragansetts were seen as the dominant power in the area. Not to take anything away from the Niantics, but the Narragansetts were known as the warriors, so we're going to identify ourselves with the warriors so that people, give us a certain level of respect. But she is moving up into the northern areas, and now we're going to start to get into the second battle of Nipsichuck. So the colonial forces were led by Lieutenant Colonel John Talcott. He had a colonial force of about 300 Connecticut Dragoons and 100 Mohegans and Pequots. So notice that now. Dragoons are cool, right? But how are they going to know how to navigate the landscape and be able to follow the Indian trip? They're not, unless you've got Indians with you, right? And notice, the Mohegans were instrumental in the Pequot Massacre of 1638, but they've linked back up with the Pequots at this time, and because the Narragansetts were always their natural enemies, they're more than happy to be with the colonial forces to go and attack the Narragansetts and the Poconokeets during this war. This force was one of the largest forces sent into Narragansett territory since the Great Swamp Massacre. So this is months after the Great Swamp Massacre, and they finally send another big force back in. And if you notice on the map there, you can see the different routes that they took. And if you'll notice on there, Wabaquasha, right up in the top left right there. So it shows you once again how instrumental even the different tribes were, and the Nipmucks, of course, played a very key role in this battle that was going on, initially linking up with the Poconokeets in, the early 70s, not feeling what was going on with the English and how they were conducting themselves, and now heavily involved in the war as it's going on. And of course, eventually, they make their way over to Nipsachuk Hill because they get report of hostile Indian activity in the Nipsachuk area since June. So there had been reports that there were hostile Indians in this region. They finally decided to send a sizable force into the region to go check it out. And this language is coming right from the National Park Service American Battlefield Protection Program Technical Report. The 1676 Battle of Nipsachuk, Identification and Evaluation. And I believe that picture comes out of there as well. Quaiapen's arrival into the area heightened the fear of attack on the part of the colonial forces. Once again, terrified of the women chiefs. Absolutely terrified of the women chiefs because they're not used to this where they come from. They're not used to women being brave warriors. They're not used to women commanding warriors. They're not used to women being in leadership positions. That's not what they want to deal with. That's not what they're looking to deal with, but that's what they're forced to deal with here. So they're absolutely terrified when there's word that she's coming to the area. So now we get into the second battle of Nipsachuk, and once again, the attack is happening early in the morning. Just like the first battle was, this one is happening 1 hour after sunrise. It was a surprise attack on a Narragansett camp of at least 170 people, and out of those 170, 125 of them, mostly women and children, were killed, and 45 were reported captured. So this was very, very different style of warfare that the local Indian tribes were used to. Definitely there was a lot of fighting that was going on, but mostly what you found in the Indian tribes was people would die, but then a lot of times the side that lost would either be brought into kind of a subservient position with the tribe that won, and a lot of times they would even be adopted into the tribe that won and become warriors for them. I forget the gentleman's name, but when the Narragansetts were fighting the Pequots down in the what's the Ewo's territory, Chief? His tribe. Wickapog. There was a battle down in the Wickapog area, and the Narragansett forces were being led by a Pequot, who had moved away from the Pequots and was fighting on the side of the Narragansetts. So that was very common. The wholesale slaughtering, especially of women and children, wasn't something that the Indians were used to. It was horrifying to them. It was said how distraught the Narragansetts were after the Pequot massacre when they saw them just burning them. And they say, well, hold on a second. You know, that's not what we signed up for. We thought we were going to fight and defeat them, and then, you know, we would have them, and we could control them because we don't like the Pequots anyway. And you guys are just slaughtering them, and then you're sending them off into slavery. So that was very demoralizing and disheartening to the indigenous folks that were here, just seeing the level of savagery that was taking place in these wars. This was not the way that we fought wars. The battle was a well-planned and coordinated attack that can be broken into 8 distinct phases or sequences. The first was the approach of the English Dragoons and the Pequot/Mohegan to Nipsachuk. The second was the Allied encampment. So notice though, they sent the Pequots and the Mohegans, so they sent the Indians first. You guys go first, and you guys take the brunt, and then we'll come in and clean up after you guys have done some damage. Then you have the Allied encampment. Third, you have the reconnoitre of the Cat Hill Matidity Swamp area. I got corrected by that by North Smithfield friends when I didn't say it correctly. Then you have the Allied advance and initial attack, the envelopment of the Narragansett camp in domestic areas, pursuit of the Narragansett in the Matidity Swamp, the encirclement of Matidity Swamp, and then the final phase of the battle in Matidity Swamp. So they kind of set them up, surrounded them, and then just wiped them out. And of course, during this battle, and this is Chapter 1, Introduction, page 4 of the National Park Service, American Battlefield Protection, says, from the perspective of the Narragansetts and their allies, the surprise attack was a devastating blow that claimed many lives, including that of the Sun Squaw Quaiapen. So it was during this second battle that the feared and respected Chief Quaiapen was killed by the European colonists, once again in a surprise attack and in a bloody massacre. The attack, she was one of the last principal Narragansett sachems to be killed or captured by the English. So once again, not only was she a woman chief, but she was one of the chiefs that actually made it the longest in terms of still fighting and still holding on to her power and still protecting her lands. And several of her lieutenants. The attack doomed a possible opportunity to negotiate peace, and Quaiapen's death effectively ended Narragansett resistance. So the Narragansett power ended with the death of the Sun Squaw Quaiapen. There was another very prominent chief, Pumham, but I believe he was killed before that. He was the chief of Showamet. He died in the Dedham Woods area, and it was said outside of Phillip, he was the only other chief that had enough respect and authority to kind of organize all of the Indians in New England to fight against the Europeans. But he had been killed before that, and with Quaiapen's death here at the Second Battle of Nipsachuk, this is where the Narragansett resistance kind of is done away with. So you have, once again, Nipsachuk up in Nipmuc territory, which is the pretty much commencement of the King Philip's War, and once again, a Sun Squaw is involved in that. And then you have the Second Battle of Nipsachuk, which is pretty much the end of the Narragansett role in the conflict as far as being a dominant force, and that ends with the death of a Sun Squaw, who was Quaiapen. So ultimately, Quaiapen was killed in the summer of 1676 at Nipsachuk Swamp, Matidity Swamp, by Major John Talcott's forces. This comes out of the native portal, and once again, just a depiction of her. But as you can see, or hopefully as I portrayed in this presentation, very prominent role in arguably the bloodiest war per capita in U.S. history. And if we think about that right now, is that even something that would be even contemplated in today's day and age? That you would have not only one general, one female general leading forces into battle, but several of them, and that ultimately, I mean, imagine if the U.S. forces were finally wiped out with the defeat of a woman general. Now, not to say that it shouldn't be that way, right? But when we think about the way contemporary society is, that's not the way that people would normally think that a powerful nation would be defeated. And yet, this is the case with the Narragansetts, with the passing of Quaiapen, the old queen, Sun Squaw, for the Narragansetts and Niantics. So, all of this that I'm sharing and all of the presentations that we do is all part of PCEI's Real Revolution 2036 initiative, which is a multi-phase, statewide, regionally based marketing, branding, and cultural placemaking initiative. Really what we're looking to do with this is establish a unique statewide cultural tourism framework and infrastructure by linking up and collaborating with individuals who are doing this work in their region. So I always want to tip my hat off to Mr. Weed and the fantastic work he's doing with the Solms Heritage Project over in the East Bay area, connecting with the Poconokas over there. And then so excited to have two of the chiefs here, because you have a chief from down in the South County region, you have a chief from further up north than here. So what Real Revolution is about is really taking all of these indigenous histories and narratives and creating spaces for people to first be aware of them, and then for people to be able to interact with them based upon the history and the interest of the tribes that are there and the individuals that have been doing this work in those regions. It's intended to attract and sustain international cultural tourists, and it honors the three major aspects of Rhode Island's revolutionary legacy, which is the colonial history as the catalyst for the American Revolution, the indigenous heritage as the epicenter of the American Indian resistance during the King Philip's War. Because once again, how many different villages were burned down in Rhode Island during it? I know Providence was attacked. So many different villages were attacked by the Indians during the King Philip's War. And then lastly, Rhode Island's enduring reputation as a bastion of diversity and innovative thought since pre-colonial times. And all of this, which is really exciting, is intended to target the 400th year commemoration of the settlement of Providence, which is going to be in 2036, I do believe. So we've got some time, and the first phase of this, along with very similar to the great work that David Weed's been doing, is going around and informing people of this history, right? Because if people don't know that there was a Quaiapen, then people don't want to know more about her. And if people don't want to know more about her, then people aren't interested in memorializing her. And if people aren't interested in memorializing her, then when our 400th year anniversary comes around, you're going to have a bunch of people come into town and do the same old same that they've been doing and leave with no fond or exclusive memories specific to Rhode Island. And of course, there's so much of this history here that there's no reason at all that it should not be more prominent, more celebrated, and be utilized as more of an attractant to bring people here. So this presentation, Providence's Indian presentation, and hopefully as we move forward, other things that will be going on, really looking to tie all of this history and heritage to attract people to the state for a narrative that is counter to the regular one that everyone's used to. What my Chief Creative Officer, Donald King, says is that we're changing the way or enhancing the way that the story of Rhode Island is both sold and told by telling the narratives that no one talks about, but really are the narratives that people want to know about if we are stop being afraid to tell them. Lastly, and I love this picture, I have the original, someone sent it to me. These are a bunch of the chiefs in the early 1900s, right up here in the Providence area. Nipmucks, some Pocasets in there, Narragansetts. But once again, after the King Philip's War, the tribes got a much better understanding of the need to be more collaborative with each other. Can't keep fighting along tribal lines because that got us nowhere during the war, so why would we continue that? And this was all a part of the Pan-Indian movement at the time. So excited, just a couple of weeks ago, a mural went up over on Cypress Street, over on the east side, with Chief Sunset, who was my uncle, but he was up in that area, and some of the other leaders of the different tribes. And then because the artist, Deborah Spears Moorhead, wanted to bring a more contemporary view that people aren't just looking at us as in the past, put Lee and Harry. So Chief Harry the Hawk and his brother Lee Braveheart put depictions of them in there to show that, hey, look, we're still around today. This isn't something from years ago. These people, this legacy that you're seeing coming from all the way from the 1600s is alive and well today here in 2019. And I just think that this is such a beautiful picture. Ideally, I'd like to see if we can get this memorialized somewhere in Providence as well, so that we can start to once again create a network of places that people can just go to interact with this heritage, not in the form of a plaque or something that's on the ground that you might step on, but something that's alive and vibrant and that people are going to be able to take pictures with, brag to their friends that they went and saw, and ultimately attract more people to learn about this history. Because as our people say in Niski Tumpawag, we're still here. We didn't go anywhere. You know, this man right here lived right in the neighborhood where I grew up at. Lived right in the neighborhood, walked in those same streets where I grew up at, is buried right down the hill. But how many people know that? And why don't they know it? And if we can see what indigenous heritage and culture does in other parts of the country, why would we not want to do that here? So, with that being said, Aquanini Tampag, peace be unto you, friends. And as always, you can check us out at the website. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out at hello@probcei.org.